this week's Shop Talk, actually, after we picked this story, there was actually an update, which was kind of cool. But I saw this headline, and to me, it just almost did not seem real. And the headline was, "Could the Stonewall Inn close for good?" And many of us know that the Stonewall Inn is just this iconic bar. Is it Greenwich Village, John, or where is it exactly located in Manhattan?
Yeah, you're right. Down in Greenwich Village. Absolutely
Yeah,
correct. Yeah.
it's in Greenwich Village, and it was where the start of the Stonewall riots had and or started, and the probably the definitive start of the modern day LGBTQ equal rights movement. And so I just would assume that that bar, as a not only as an icon but as a tourist destination, would not be saddled with financial difficulties, and but like many restaurants and bars currently, but just overall struggling to keep the doors open. They said that the rent alone there was $40,000 a month, and they were going to do a Kickstarter or a GoFundMe program to try to figure out how to get some money raised to keep the doors open, particularly for rent and insurance payments. And so they started this movement when what happened, John? Somebody came to help.
I guess you would say an angel swooped in to save the day, right? So they did this. They started the Kickstarter thing, and that was employees and the bar owner that did that. And lo and behold, the Gill Foundation dropped in with a $250,000 donation, which is amazing. And the Gill Foundation is an organization that looks to support LGBT organizations around the country, education grants, things like this. Actually, I think the reason they came in was because the Stonewall Inn is directly across from the Stonewall. Like it's in Sheridan Square down in the Village, as Tim said earlier, and that's even though that area is like a landmark site, I think the Stonewall Monument across the street from the inn, the bar itself is not really a landmark, and that's always been a puzzle to me because it's such an institution. It's been there so long. But yeah, so the Gill Foundation came in and said queer people of color, including trans women of color like Marsha P. Johnson, who was one of the people that was there when the riots began and was one of the instigators of the movement. Sylvia Rivera and Miss Major led the uprising against police brutality at Stonewall, and in doing so, helped spark the movement for LGBT equality. We must preserve that history and the legacy of the activists who led that change. And then they actually say here, it says, as the first and only LGBTQ national monument, Stonewall is home not only to the history of our community, but also the history of our city and country. And so the owners, Lentz and Kelly, are beyond grateful, as it says here, and I would be too if I were dealing with a $40,000 a month rent bill. And obviously these last few months, bars and restaurants have not been able to function anywhere near normal, right? So
Right.
big change, and I'm really pleased at the Gill Foundation coming in and doing this. The one thing that was missing for me was from this article, and I'm really glad they did this, but how did they hear about it? Like, did someone reach out to the Gill Foundation and said, hey, this would be a super smart idea for you to give them a grant or something because of what they represent to the community?
Yeah, I wonder that as well, and it could simply have been how you and I found it. This story was posted on CNN online, and when it popped up, I just thought it was during Pride, so it was mid last week, and I thought, wow, this is kind of an odd story right now. And I read about it, and I guess I didn't. I thought, wow, of all places, a Stonewall Inn. I can't imagine that they're struggling, and what an institution, and how could we allow that to close, where so many LGBTQ bars across the country have been affected and closed for a number of reasons. But this one here, I just think is so iconic, and they may have heard about it like we did, reading about it in CNN, and said, "Hey, how can we help?" Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing about this article that I was kind of thinking about more a meta or larger idea was a lot of gay history, a lot of LGBT history seems to be evaporating. Neighborhoods change. Now, I'm not saying, like when I was younger, the Village was actually the gay spot of town, at least in Manhattan. That's moved all the way up to Hell's Kitchen now, and the Village is very different. I mean, it's still a lot of LGBTQ people live there and do business there and have shops, but it's not the density of what it was. And I just think that our history in general, unless we are actively preserving it and aware of what we're dealing with, like, oh, this is history, that we should save this, is just evaporating. And it's strange because I'm having a call tomorrow with a friend of mine named Mike, who you know, Tim, from the Commercial Closet days. And he reached out and said, hey, let's get together and have a quick talk. And you remember the Commercial Closet was a website that would put up positive representations of LGBTQ people in advertising.
Right.
Naturally, we knew Mike quite well because Subaru was one of the top companies for years on end. I mean, I guess after a while they had to stop giving us awards because you had to award other people. But that site was bought by, or they were absorbed by Glad or something, I think. And that's that. I don't even see the site anymore, and no one's archiving or updating it. And you wonder to yourself, did we move on beyond that point of the necessary curatorial thing of saying this is how we're represented in the media, or specifically in advertising and marketing? And I just think that 10, 20, 15 years, X number of years from now, aren't we going to look back at certain things? Like, because when you and I were doing the work we did in the 90s and the early 2000s, that was pretty groundbreaking, right?
Yeah, and it's funny you bring that up because in the last month I had been interviewed 2 or 3 different times regarding the Subaru campaign that your agency did with us at Subaru to reach the LGBTQ consumer, and every single one of the people who contacted me were from overseas and found me through LinkedIn, and B was probably 23, 24, 25, and they were doing this story that they just thought was great. And I said, this probably happened and you weren't born yet, or you were just an infant when this work was done. And they all seem to think it's pretty cool and can't imagine that it was happening back then, that we were doing it and what it was like and what the time was like. And you and I have spoke to some corporate clients and talked to the employee groups, about the LGBTQ employee groups, about what it was like to be doing this advertising or to be in corporate America at that time. So it's a great question. One of the interviewers, when we were done, he said, you guys should do a book about this. And we laughed about it because you and I have always thought, well, maybe we would, but who really wants to read it, or who wants to, should it be something that's put down in history or talked about? We know that there's a Harvard business case study that's been written about it. But, is it worthy of doing some sort of book about here's what happened and why, or here's how? I'm not sure.
When we're offline, I'll give you I had a thought about that. And as you brought up again, I think that based on some of our conversations of recent days, I do think there's value in putting something down about this. Now, the problem I have is, would you defer to a business book format? Oh, and before I forget, I don't want to go too far off the point of the Stonewall Inn. I think as a community, recognizing what is our history and what deserves to be preserved or to be talked about or immortalized somehow is a very important thing. And if we let it go, someone else is going to decide that for us, or it's not going to get immortalized or curated or, cataloged at all. But back to the book thing, I would not want to do it as a business book, would you? Or I wouldn't want to do it as here's a lesson in how to do this. I think the stories behind how we actually got this done for 15 years are far more hilarious than here's how you do it. And I not always funny, but certainly interesting.
Yeah, I think for me, I think it would be better. It might even be better done as a podcast. So you did an eight series podcast, and you and I had questions that were to be answered or had somebody ask the questions. You and I have been on panels before, where you're asked the questions. The dates aren't as important as you said the stories behind it, right? So
yeah.
If you were to say we're going to break this up into 8 podcasts or 6 20-minute podcasts, whatever the number is, and then have you and I actually do a verbal history or an oral history of it, probably would be of more use and more entertaining than reading about a dry business case, I think.
Agreed. And you know what brings the story? I'm going to just tell listeners, we might have talked about it before at Sirius or one of our earlier shows, is the Buff Book story. And the Buff Book story does not translate into something. It would take a good writer. I guess we could pull it off to make but the thing about it was the funny presence in the room. So I'm down presenting magazines to Tim and Tim and some of the other people in marketing, and we're in this little conference room, and it was a media review, and these things were done quite frequently, like on a yearly basis, to see where we wanted to be. What do the books look like? Because after all, you're taking a $32,000 car. and you're putting it in a magazine, and that ad has to be in a certain appropriate place, and it has to look correct, maybe front of book, back cover, whatever. So, and then we're going over the media plan. So, I think it was Tim Mahoney said, or did you to say, Tim, like, do you have any plans for the Buff books? So I'm sitting there thinking, Buff book. And I said, well, I guess we could go in men's health and men's fitness. And the two of
For God's
you
sakes.
cracked up. You could not stop laughing because in auto industry parlance, or, vernacular, thank you. A Buff book was road and drive, right? It was like car and road, whatever the magazines
road
were.
And track, motor track,
road and
car
track,
and driver, right? Yeah, that's
Any
what
plans?
the Buff book is. The car Buff books.
Any plans for the Buff books? Well, yeah, many gay men get men's fitness and men's health. So that would make a great story. Audio. I think that's a fun one, right?
Yeah, no, I think an audio version, but it obviously would have to have a beginning, an arc, and then the end. But yeah, I was wondering about the best way to present it, and I'm thinking it might be just an audio version, but we'll have to see. Sometimes you and I just don't think that the story is that remarkable in some cases. In many cases, I guess it is, and particularly for the time that it happened, it is. There were very few brands. It was us and maybe Absolute and American Airlines, right? Outside of some booze and what you call the sin categories.
Well, to tell you how unique it was, my agency, my first agency was hired by a financial services firm here in the Northeast. And I went to give what was supposed to be the final presentation for beautiful and tasteful creative for some of their products. I think it might have been insurance or annuities. I forget which category that was. But we're in this boardroom, a beautiful building overlooking a park. And it's one of those suit and tie financial guy kind of. They're all sitting around. Everybody's stern. They have their hands steepled. You know how it was back then. And everything's going swimmingly, and then one guy raises his hand. He says, he goes, I would just like to comment to the room. He goes, I would like to mention to everybody or remind them that what we're really talking about here is promoting the idea of men who have sex with men or women who have sex with women. And that's kind of like someone rolling a stink bomb into the boardroom. I recovered. I answered. The consultant who had monitored this whole thing said, you did great. You handled that well. But, the creative really, I think it ran for 1 or 2 months, and that particular individual's internal voice managed to turn the whole thing off.
Right.
And so, yeah, to your long-winded way of saying to your point, we may think nothing of it, but they're really, really amazing accomplishment considering the other industries that I used to work in or work for, and their resistance and hesitancy to doing anything that was speaking to this consumer. And by the way, we were doing ads that were called in-book campaigns. We assumed that if you were going to read out or advocate that you were in fact gay or lesbian. So, yeah, interesting. So, I think there's a story there, Tim. We'll have to pursue that. But the bigger thing of making sure that our history is preserved, like the Stonewall Inn, I think is a very important thing.
Agreed, Mr. Nash. Agreed. So, we'll have to. Maybe we can go on the road. People seem to be on the road.
We'll do a shtick. We'll do like the Ajax liquor store for the Subaru story. Run, ringy dingy. Hello, Tim Bennett's office.